Thank you very much, and thanks for coming. Just by a little way of background, I grew up in Bolivia and spent most of my career largely as a foreign correspondent for the Washington Post, covering Latin America, including the wars in Central America, and then on to the Andean region and covering the drug wars in Colombia. Spent a lot of time in Venezuela, Ecuador. Grew up in Bolivia, spent a lot of time there. So I'm not unfamiliar with the region and have lived there for probably half of my adult life. I think it's useful to look at what's happening in Latin America in two different ways. One, what does Chavez actually want? He tends to come off, I think, especially to audiences here, as a bit crazy and erratic, and he could well be a little certainly erratic. But he does have a plan. He's not thrashing around in the wilderness, doing whatever comes across his mind on any given day. In fact, he has a clear vision of what the Bolivarian Revolution is, what it would entail, and what is good for it is what is good for him is good for the Bolivarian Revolution. I think it's good to keep that in mind because we often portray him as this sort of madman without a plan, or just sort of grandiose dreams with nothing concrete. And in fact, he does have fairly specific ideas about what he wants to see happen. And I also think it's very useful to look at what's happening in Latin America in terms of, in the emerging threats there, in terms of a transnational pipeline. I do a lot of work with the U.S. government looking at organized criminal organizations and terrorist organizations and the overlap. And I think that the model that the picture that I most like to use is that of a pipeline, because the pipeline will carry essentially anything that's illicit. And if you look at any specific point on the pipeline, it doesn't seem particularly threatening. If you hook the pipeline together and look where it actually runs, then you begin, I think, to get a much more serious picture. And if you look at what's happening, the pipeline that I'm describing runs from the northern tier of South America through Central America, Mexico, and then across our border. And the far end in this particular case is Iran, and I think that adds a whole new dimension to the threat the pipeline poses, because this pipeline has been functioning for many years. It's been taking drugs north, illegal immigrants north on it, and the different criminal organizations all need the pipeline, and so they overlap in the pipeline because they need the same people to do the same things at particular nodes as they move along. Moving south, you have the money flowing from the drug trade, weapons, and stolen cars. Anything you want to put in the pipeline will get to its destination. It doesn't matter if it's alive or inert. It doesn't matter if it's legal or illegal. The pipeline will deliver it for you. And there are some countries where the pipeline itself is the source of great contention, as in Central America, which has no natural resources, putting people into the pipeline, but control of that pipeline is what the gangs fight over in Central America, because it controls the profits that move there. So I think it's worth remembering that. And in my mind, what we have is Iran on one side of the pipeline, closely allied with Hezbollah, which is a functioning branch of their security forces in some ways, and acts not entirely independently of the Iranian government, the Quds Force, and the other Iranian intelligence apparatus. And then you look, okay, so you have that, and then they're investing heavily in moving around Latin America in different ways, particularly in Venezuela. And what does Venezuela do at this particular juncture? Well, you have the closing down of the ability of the United States and other governments to monitor drug trafficking coming out of Venezuela. And you see a huge black hole develop, and then you see massive amounts of cocaine flowing out of Venezuela. It's really interesting to me to note, as I spent a lot of time in Africa too as a correspondent, that the two biggest cocaine busts in West African history, one in Guinea-Bissau and one in Sierra Leone in the last few months, were both on Venezuelan aircraft flown by Colombian pilots. And I think that's probably not isolated incidents. I think if you look from there, then the next piece of the pipeline in my mind is Colombia. You have Colombia that's been fighting the FARC for 44 years. Colombia is finally getting its act together after I've been writing a paper, and I've been going back and looking at some of the things I and others wrote in 1997 when the DIA and CIA were predicting that the Colombian government would fall within 5 years and become a narco state, because the FARC had grown to such a level that they were controlling 60% of the national territory, were on the verge of military victory. That seems far removed from where we are now. I think the Colombians have demonstrated a remarkable capacity to wage a successful counterinsurgency war with help from the United States. But what does this mean? The FARC became what? It became migrated from a a Marxist rural insurgency to a full-blown cartel in the course of several years, but beginning particularly in the late 1980s into the early 1990s, they became deeply involved in drug trafficking. And they need state sponsorship. Why? Because they need to move their goods around, they need to move their people around. And Chavez has had a relationship with them since the 1990s. Much of what we can now document of what happened of the relationship between Chavez and the FARC goes to the computers that were Raul Reyes, the deputy FARC commander who was killed on March 1st of this year. He had 600 some odd gigabytes of data on 4 different computers and memory sticks that were taken, and I've done a lot of time analyzing these documents and going through them, and they're really rather extraordinary. Some of them are very prosaic, but some of them are quite enlightening and you can see the relationship over time get closer and closer with Chavez. Chavez thinks he can use the FARC for specific ends, particularly becoming a person on the international stage who can free the hostages, etc. And FARC wants specific things from him, namely they list them in different things. They want weapons, they want political recognition, they want to get off the terrorism list, etc., etc. So that's one piece of the pie. From there, where do you go? You go to Nicaragua, in my mind, where you now have Daniel Ortega back in power, also having tremendously tight ties with Iran, which we'll go into in a little bit, and a history of dealing with terrorist organizations and giving them false documentation. From there, you go to Mexico, you have the drug war now raging, and from there you have people that cross our border on a regular basis. So to me, if you look at that's what's worrisome. It's not each individual piece which seems manageable on its own. It's the pipeline that allows Iran and Venezuela to move people through allied groups across different parts of the territory to our country. And I think you also have to ask the fundamental question, which I seldom hear asked in government circles, and I'm always puzzled by it. What the hell is Iran doing in Latin America? There's no diaspora there that has of any particular significance. There's no religious affinity. There's no cultural affinity, and until recently there's been very little trade. There's no reason for Iran to suddenly be there unless they have something else in mind. And that something else, I would argue, is the ability to destabilize the United States and the hemisphere if they feel that they need to do that because of what the U.S. is doing with them or for any number of reasons. But I think you have to look at it in strategic terms. They're not there giving away billions of dollars because they like Latin America. They have nothing in common, no language, nothing. And yet they're willing to spend billions, tens of billions. We don't know how much because the deals are usually so opaque that you can't actually find out what's actually delivered and how much is there. But it's really, you got to think, okay, why is this? And I think that the answer is fairly obvious if you discount the other factors that normally drive thriving and rapidly developing commercial and diplomatic relations. And I think if you look at Latin America, Iran's diplomatic presence in Latin America, it's also grown hugely. They've opened embassies in Nicaragua, which have been closed. They're doing Bolivia, Chile, Ecuador, St. Vincent and Grenadines, 7 other Caribbean islands are all developing ties with Iran now. And you see that, and not just in Venezuela do you see the presence of these people, but as Nancy mentioned earlier, you see the presence in other countries growing fairly rapidly. I think one of the interesting things to look at is the relation in monitoring the relationship is the number of visits that each head of state has made to the other countries. Chavez has visited Iran 4 times since Ahmadinejad took office in 2005, and at least twice before that. Ahmadinejad has visited Latin America 4 times in the last 3 years, and more than he's visited any other region in the world, and each trip included a stop in Venezuela. In contrast, President Bush has made 1 high-profile trip to Latin America since the 9/11 attacks, and I think that that's fairly telling. One of the things, now what does Iran want out of all this besides the ability to carry out intelligence operations and place its people around the region? I think that one of the primary things they're doing in Venezuela is using the banking system to avoid sanctions. I think if you look at, there's the Banco Internacional de Desarrollo was established in September 2007. The 40 million shares of the bank are all owned by the Saderat Iran Bank, and each share is valued as 1,000 bolivares. All 7 of the bank's directors, as well as their 7 alternates, are Iranian citizens, and we have the documents to show that. The Saderat Bank Group was designated by OFAC in October 2007, accused of being a financial vehicle for the government of Iran to fund Hezbollah, Hamas, and other